I was 22 years old when this happened. At the time, I was studying nursing in Lexington, Kentucky, and working part-time at a pharmacy to help cover my college expenses. My grandparents owned a rural property about an hour outside the city, where they had lived for decades before moving closer to medical services. Even after relocating, they kept the house and land because they were attached to the place. From time to time, someone in the family would spend a few days there to make sure everything was in order. That weekend, my parents were traveling, and my grandparents asked if I could stay at the property for 2 nights. It seemed simple enough. I had known the place since childhood. The house was surrounded by open fields, patches of woodland, and an old abandoned barn located a few hundred yards from the main residence. The barn hadn't been used in years. Part of the structure was still standing, but the interior was used only to store old tools and miscellaneous items that nobody used anymore. I arrived at the property late on a Friday afternoon. I spent a few hours checking doors, fences, and feeding the cats that usually wandered around the area. When night fell, the isolation of the place became much more noticeable. During the day, the fields felt peaceful and familiar. At night, it was different. The house stood almost completely alone in the darkness. There were no neighbors close enough for me to see their lights through the windows. After dinner, I locked all the doors and sat in the living room watching television. The weather was pleasant, and there was nothing to suggest that the night would be any different from any other. Shortly after midnight, while passing by one of the windows facing the back of the property, I noticed something strange. A light appeared inside the barn. At first, I thought it was a reflection of something. I stopped to get a better look. A few seconds later, the light disappeared. Then it appeared again. It was faint and yellowish, like a flashlight or a portable lamp being moved around inside the building. I stood watching for nearly a full minute. The light would appear, disappear, and then reappear in different parts of the barn's interior. My first reaction was to find a simple explanation. Maybe a neighbor had gone over to check the property. Maybe someone in the family had forgotten to tell me about some maintenance work. Even so, it didn't seem normal. I couldn't think of anyone who would show up there without warning, especially after midnight. I continued watching through the window for several minutes. The light would appear in one area of the barn and then emerge somewhere else, as if someone were walking around inside. I thought about calling my grandparents, but it was late, and I didn't want to worry them over something that probably had a simple explanation. Instead, I took out my phone and tried zooming in with the camera. The distance was too great. All I could make out were small flashes of light through the openings in the structure. No silhouette, no details that would help identify who was there. After a while, the movement seemed to slow down. The light remained visible for a few seconds and then disappeared completely. I waited for it to come back. It didn't. I stood at the window for another minute, staring at the barn now submerged in darkness. Nothing happened. Gradually, I convinced myself that maybe someone had simply checked on something and left. I partially closed the curtain and returned to the living room, trying to ignore the situation. That's when I heard a sound coming from the front of the house. It sounded like footsteps on the wooden porch. They weren't hurried footsteps or someone running. They were slow, heavy, as if a person were walking without the slightest concern. I immediately froze. The sound continued for a few seconds. Then it stopped. My heart began racing. The first thing I thought was that some animal had climbed onto the porch. But the footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded too regular, too human. I slowly walked into the kitchen where the monitor connected to the property's security cameras was located. My grandparents had installed several cameras years earlier because of how isolated the place was. The screen was turned off to save power. I switched it on and began cycling through the camera feeds. The front camera showed an empty porch. The side of the house looked normal as well. Then I opened the feed from the camera facing the back of the property. That's when I felt my stomach drop. A person was walking across the field toward the house. The image was grainy because of the night vision mode, but it was clear enough to see a human figure coming from the exact direction of the barn. I stared at the screen, unable to look away. The camera displayed only a black and white image, but it was enough to see that someone was genuinely approaching the residence. The person walked slowly, showing no sign of urgency. They weren't running, hiding, or trying to avoid the cameras. On the contrary, they seemed to be simply crossing the field toward the house. I tried zooming in, but the image quality was too poor to make out a face or details of the clothing. What caught my attention was the way the person moved. Their steps were steady and deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. As I watched the screen, the figure disappeared from the camera's view as it reached the area around the house. My heart started pounding much harder. I switched to the side camera expecting to find them again. Nothing. I switched to the front camera. Nothing there either. For several seconds I flipped between the feeds, unable to locate the person. The feeling of vulnerability hit immediately. I was alone on an isolated property in the middle of the night, and someone I didn't know had just walked directly from the barn to the house. Then I heard another sound coming from the porch. This time closer, a long creak of wood bending beneath someone's weight. The sound came from the front of the house. I immediately looked at the corresponding camera. The porch was still empty. That made me even more nervous. I could hear the footsteps, but I couldn't see anyone. I hurried to a side window and pulled back only a small section of the curtain. The darkness outside was nearly complete. The only illumination came from an automatic light near the garage. I didn't see anyone. I returned to the monitor. As I watched the feeds, I heard another creak from the porch. Then another. It sounded like someone slowly pacing back and forth. I grabbed my phone and started typing a message to my father explaining what was happening. Before I could even finish, movement appeared on one of the cameras. This time, the figure was near the side of the house. For only a few seconds, they were partially illuminated by the exterior light, just enough for me to realize that the person was looking directly at the residence. Not at the doors, not at the parked vehicles, at the house. At that moment, I stopped trying to come up with simple explanations. I locked the kitchen door again, checked every window, and called my father. He answered almost immediately. As I explained the situation, I kept my eyes fixed on the camera monitor. My father told me to stay inside the house and call the local sheriff's office if the person remained on the property. While we were talking, I checked the side camera again. The figure had disappeared once more. That didn't reassure me at all. In fact, it was worse. I knew someone was outside, but I could no longer locate them. For the next several minutes, I repeatedly checked every camera feed. The front porch remained empty. The side of the house was empty too. The rear camera showed only the dark field and the distant barn. Then something appeared again. This time, the person was standing near a fence only a few yards from the house. They weren't walking. They weren't doing anything. Just standing there staring at the house. The image didn't allow me to see their face, but the direction of their body made it obvious. A chill immediately ran down my spine. I picked up the phone and called the sheriff's office. I explained that I was alone on a rural property and that an unknown person was moving around the area during the night. While speaking with the dispatcher, I kept the camera feed open. The figure remained motionless. The dispatcher asked for the address and said a deputy would be sent to check the situation, but warned me that the property was relatively far from town. That meant I would have to wait. They were probably the longest 20 minutes of my life. At one point, the person finally started moving again, but instead of approaching the house, they slowly began walking back in the direction they had come from. I watched the figure cross part of the field until it disappeared once again into the darkness near the barn. After that, it never appeared on any camera again. I continued watching the feeds non-stop until the deputies arrived. When they finally got there and searched the property, they found no one. They also checked the barn. According to them, there were signs that someone had been there recently. Some footprints, signs of movement on the ground, and an old flashlight abandoned near an interior wall, but no person. I spent the rest of that night awake. The deputies remained on the property for a while, and then continued searching the surrounding area without success. The next morning, in daylight, the barn seemed much less threatening than it had during the night. Even so, when I walked over to it accompanied by one of the deputies, I was struck by the distance. That person had crossed the entire dark field in the middle of the night just to approach the house and watch it. They never discovered who it was. My grandparents asked the few neighbors in the area, and no one reported seeing a stranger nearby. To this day, I don't know what that person's intentions were. Maybe they were looking for shelter. Maybe they were exploring rural properties. Maybe they had some other reason. What I have never been able to forget is the camera image showing someone leaving the abandoned barn and walking directly toward the house where I was alone. I grew up visiting that property and always considered it one of the most peaceful places I knew. After that night, I was never able to look at that barn the same way again. Story 2. I was 29 years old when this happened. At the time, I lived in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and worked remotely for a software company. My parents owned a large country house in the northern part of the state. in an area surrounded by dense forest and widely spaced properties. It wasn't exactly a cabin. It was a large house built for vacations and holidays, but it sat empty for much of the year. From time to time, a family member would spend a few days there to make sure everything was functioning properly. That autumn, my parents were traveling and asked me to spend a weekend at the property. Since I worked remotely, it seemed like a good opportunity to change my environment for a few days. I arrived at the house during the afternoon. The place was exactly as I remembered it: quiet, isolated, and surrounded by miles of forest. The nearest road was several minutes away by car, and there were no visible neighbors from any of the windows. Despite the isolation, I had always liked that house. It was one of the few places where I could truly disconnect from the distractions of everyday life. On the second night of the trip, a cold front moved into the area. It rained almost non-stop from late afternoon onward. The wind caused the tree branches to strike one another, and the sound of rain hitting the roof was constant. After dinner, I sat working on my laptop in the main living room. The house had a sunroom at the back, a space surrounded by large glass panels facing the forest. During the day, it was one of the most pleasant areas of the property. At night, it was different. The windows reflected the illuminated interior of the house and turned the outside into a wall of darkness where almost nothing could be seen. Shortly after 11 o'clock that night, I heard a sound coming from that direction. 3 sharp knocks against the glass. They sounded as though they had been made with knuckles. I immediately stood up and walked to the sunroom. The rain was still falling heavily. I looked through the windows trying to see something outside. I saw no one. I also saw no signs of animals near the house. I spent several seconds staring into the darkness before concluding that a branch had probably been blown against the glass by the wind. At that moment, it seemed like the most logical explanation. I returned to the living room and tried to continue working. About 20 minutes later, I heard the knocks again. Exactly 3, sharp and evenly spaced. This time, the sound seemed clearer, less like something carried by the wind and more like someone deliberately tapping on the glass. I got up immediately and went back to the sunroom. As soon as I approached the windows, the knocking stopped. I turned on the backyard floodlight and examined the area around the house. The light extended only a short distance before being swallowed by the darkness of the forest. The rain was falling heavily enough to make visibility difficult. There was no one there. No vehicles, no sign of movement among the trees. I stood watching for almost a minute before returning inside. This time I started feeling uneasy, not because of the sound itself, but because it stopped precisely when I reached the window. Even so, I kept trying to find rational explanations. Maybe some loose part of the structure was being struck by the wind. Maybe the rain was creating strange noises against the glass. I was already convincing myself of that when I heard the knocking for the 3rd time. Now there was no doubt that the sound was coming from the sunroom's glass door. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. My heart immediately began racing. I hurried to the area and once again found no one. This time, I opened the interior door connecting the house to the sunroom and stood there for a few seconds looking outside through the glass. The sound of the rain was so loud that it drowned out almost everything else. The temperature had dropped significantly as well. I was trying to see beyond the reflections of the interior lights when I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. The ground directly below the glass door was not visible from where I stood. There was a slight elevation difference in the construction, and the lower edge of the window blocked part of the view. If someone had been crouching close against the wall of the house, I wouldn't have been able to see them. I pushed that thought away almost immediately because it sounded paranoid. Even so, I began feeling that unpleasant sensation that something was wrong. I closed the door, locked all the entrances to the house again, and decided to check the exterior security cameras installed around the property. The cameras could be accessed through an app on my phone. I sat at the kitchen table and started reviewing the recordings from the previous several minutes. The quality wasn't perfect because of the rain and darkness, but it was sufficient to show the area around the house. First, I examined the footage corresponding to the first series of knocks. For several seconds, I saw nothing but rain illuminated by the exterior floodlights. Then a figure appeared in the lower corner of the image. My stomach immediately dropped. There was a person crouched against the wall of the sunroom, so close to the structure that they almost disappeared from the field of view of the windows. The person remained motionless for a few seconds. Then they raised one hand and knocked on the glass 3 times. As soon as the interior lights of the house began moving, probably when I approached to investigate, The figure quickly crouched back down. I stared at the screen in disbelief. I advanced to the next recording. The same pattern repeated itself. The person remained crouched below the line of the windows, completely hidden from anyone inside the house. The more footage I reviewed, the worse the situation seemed. The figure had been there for quite some time. In one recording, the person could be seen slowly crawling along the exterior wall of the sunroom to remain outside my field of vision at all times. I couldn't distinguish a face because the individual was wearing something dark over their head, possibly a hood. It was also impossible to determine their age or physical characteristics with any accuracy. What disturbed me most was realizing that they appeared to know exactly where the blind spots of the house were. At no point did they walk through areas fully exposed to the windows. They always stayed low, using the structure itself as cover. I continued reviewing the footage until I reached the most recent recording. In it, the person was still outside, crouched, motionless, only a few yards from the glass door. The recording had been made just minutes earlier. That meant there was a very good chance they were still there at that exact moment. My heart began pounding. I immediately locked the kitchen door, grabbed the phone, and called the local police while keeping the camera feeds open on my screen. As I spoke with the dispatcher, I continued watching the live footage. I tried explaining the situation without sounding exaggerated, but even to me it sounded absurd. The person wasn't trying to break into the house. They weren't stealing anything. They were simply remaining hidden outside, watching and occasionally knocking on the glass. The dispatcher instructed me to stay inside the residence and informed me that a patrol unit would be sent, but also warned me that the property was located in a very remote area. That meant I would have to wait. During the following minutes, I watched every movement through the cameras. At one point, the figure moved again. They left the area around the sunroom and slowly began circling the side of the house. They remained crouched most of the time, always close to the walls, always avoiding the more brightly lit areas. On one of the cameras, I watched them stop near a window and remain motionless for several seconds, apparently looking inside. That was probably the most disturbing part of the entire experience. It didn't seem like the behavior of someone who was lost, intoxicated, or looking for help. It seemed like someone studying the house and observing whoever was inside. A short time later, the headlights of a vehicle appeared through the trees along the access road. As soon as I realized it was the patrol car, I immediately looked back at the cameras. The figure was still visible on one of the side views. Then something happened that has stayed with me ever since. The person seemed to notice the arrival of the vehicle before I even heard any sound outside. For the first time, they stood fully upright and completely visible. Then they ran toward the forest. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. The image quality wasn't good enough to reveal facial details, but I was able to tell that it was an adult man. He disappeared among the trees before the officers even reached the area around the house. When the deputies arrived, I immediately showed them the recordings. They searched the property and the nearby forest for a long time. They found some fresh footprints in the mud caused by the rain, but they never located anyone. They also found no unfamiliar vehicles on the nearby roads. It was as if the man had simply emerged from the forest and then returned to it when he realized the police were arriving. I spent the rest of that night awake, and the officers recommended that I leave the property the next morning, at least until my parents returned. That is exactly what I did. Before leaving, I reviewed the videos one more time. What continues to bother me isn't the knocking on the door, nor is it the fact that someone was prowling around the house. What truly disturbs me is realizing how determined that person was to remain invisible. Every time I heard the knocking and went to investigate, he was already crouched in the exact spot where I couldn't see him through the glass. He knew that. The recordings make it very clear. This wasn't someone hiding by accident. It was someone who understood perfectly how to stay outside my field of vision while continuing to watch the house. My parents still own that property and nothing similar has happened there since. But even today, whenever I walk past that sunroom, I remember the recording showing someone hidden just below the window, while I stared directly at the spot without realizing there was a person only a few feet away. Story 3. I was 34 years old when this happened. At the time, I lived in Richmond, Virginia, and worked as an administrative assistant for an insurance company. A few months earlier, my grandmother had passed away, and the old family home had been left to me. It was a large Victorian house built in the late 19th century, located in a small town in rural Virginia. I had visited the place many times throughout my childhood and teenage years, but I had never spent much time exploring the entire house. For years, several rooms had remained closed off or simply went unused. After the property was officially transferred into my name, I decided to spend a weekend there organizing documents, sorting through old furniture, and assessing what would need to be renovated. I arrived on a Friday afternoon with a few boxes, cleaning supplies, and enough clothes for 2 days. The house was empty, quiet, and carried that distinctive smell of old wood and rarely used rooms. Despite the size of the property, I didn't feel uncomfortable there. It was a place filled with family memories. I spent most of the following morning organizing documents scattered throughout drawers and cabinets on the first floor. Around early afternoon, I decided to explore the second floor more thoroughly. The main hallway was long and connected several old bedrooms that I already knew. As I walked through it, examining the condition of the walls and doors, I noticed something that confused me. There was a door at the western end of the hallway that I honestly didn't remember ever seeing before. It wasn't a hidden or secret door. It was simply there at the end of a small section of hallway. What caught my attention was that it looked different from the others. The paint was darker, and the lock appeared relatively new compared to the rest of the house. Out of curiosity, I tried opening it, but it was locked. I searched nearby drawers for a key without success. For several minutes, I tried to remember whether any member of my family had ever mentioned that room. I couldn't recall anything. Eventually, I set the matter aside and continued with my work. After all, in a house that old, it was entirely possible that there was a room I had simply never explored as a child. I went back downstairs and continued organizing boxes of documents in the dining room. For several hours, I remained completely occupied sorting through old papers, photographs, and correspondence accumulated over decades. The time passed quickly, and I only realized it was getting dark when I had to turn on the lights throughout the house. It was around that time that I heard the first noise coming from upstairs. It sounded like something being dragged across the floor. The sound was brief, maybe 2 or 3 seconds long, but loud enough to be clearly noticeable. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The silence returned immediately. My first thought was that the house was simply reacting to changes in temperature. Old buildings often produce creaks, pops, and strange noises. I went back to work. About 15 minutes later, I heard another sound. This time it resembled a sharp thud coming from the same area of the second floor. Again, the noise stopped before I could determine exactly where it had originated. That was when I remembered the locked door at the end of the western hallway. There was no reason to connect the two things, but that was exactly what happened in my mind. I tried ignoring the situation for a while longer, but the sounds continued appearing at irregular intervals. Sometimes it was a creak. Other times it sounded like something lightly touching a wall or a door. Nothing dramatic. The problem was the repetition. They always came from the same area of the house. Finally, I decided to go upstairs and investigate. I brought a flashlight because part of the second floor lighting wasn't working properly. When I reached the hallway, everything looked completely normal. I walked to the locked door and stood there listening. For several seconds, I heard nothing. Then a very faint noise came from the other side. It sounded like something scraping against the floor. It was brief, but enough to convince me that I hadn't imagined the previous noises. I grabbed the doorknob again. It was still locked. I spent several minutes examining the door, and eventually found a small key tucked inside a drawer of an old piece of furniture nearby. I have no idea whether it was actually the correct key or just a coincidence, but when I inserted it into the lock, it turned perfectly. At that moment, I began feeling a discomfort I couldn't explain. Even so, I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The door opened with difficulty, as if it hadn't been used in a very long time. The first thing I noticed was the smell of accumulated dust. I shined my flashlight inside and was surprised to discover that the room was completely empty. There were no pieces of furniture, boxes, or stored belongings. Just old walls, a worn wooden floor, and a single small window facing the forest behind the house. I stepped inside slowly and examined every corner. The room seemed smaller than I had imagined from the hallway. I also found nothing that could explain the noises I had been hearing. No trapped animals, no loose pipes, no window rattling in the wind. The room was silent. I remained there for several minutes trying to understand why it had been locked. The more I looked at it, the more ordinary it seemed. Eventually, I concluded that it had probably been some forgotten storage room over the years. After quickly checking the space, I stepped back into the hallway and closed the door behind me. It was only when I started descending the stairs that I noticed something strange. The house felt too quiet. Silence wasn't unusual there, but at that moment I had the uncomfortable feeling that something had changed while I was upstairs. When I reached the dining room, I immediately realized what was wrong. Some of the boxes I had organized were no longer in the same positions. At first, I thought I might be confusing my own memory. I had been handling documents for hours, and perhaps I had simply forgotten where I had placed everything. But then I noticed something impossible to ignore. An old photo album that I had left open on the table was now closed and resting on top of a stack of documents. I was absolutely certain that I had not placed it there. I stood staring at it for several seconds. Then I examined the rest of the room. A chair that had been pulled away from the table was now pushed underneath it. One of the boxes near the door had been moved to the opposite side of the room. None of the changes were significant enough to attract immediate attention, but together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Someone had moved things while I was upstairs. The problem was that I was alone in the house. At least that was what I had believed until that moment. I immediately began mentally reviewing everything I had done since arriving at the property. I tried finding a simple explanation. Maybe I had moved those objects without paying attention. Maybe I was tired after spending an entire day sorting through documents. But the more I analyzed the situation, the less that theory made sense. I remembered perfectly leaving the photo album open because I had been sorting family photographs. I was also certain about the positions of the boxes because I had spent several minutes arranging them to create more space in the room. I picked up my phone and began walking through the house, checking every room on the first floor. The kitchen was empty. The main living room was empty as well. I checked the bathrooms, closets, and even several rooms I had not planned to visit that night. I found no one. Even so, my sense of unease continued growing. For the first time since arriving at the property, I began considering the possibility that someone had entered the house without my noticing. The doors were locked, but the house was old. There were several secondary entrances, old windows, and access points that I didn't fully know myself. That was when I heard another noise from the second floor. This time it sounded like a footstep. Just one, short and heavy. The sound came from the direction of the western hallway. My entire body immediately tensed. I stood still, trying to hear something more. A few seconds later, I heard another creak. That was enough for me to abandon the idea of spending the night there alone. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and walked toward the front door without wasting any time investigating. Before leaving, I glanced quickly toward the staircase. The upper portion of the hallway was submerged in shadows because one of the light bulbs wasn't working. I saw no one. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching me from there. I got into my car, locked the doors, and called a cousin who lived in the same town. I explained that something strange was happening in the house and asked him to meet me there. About 40 minutes later, we returned to the property together. We conducted a complete search of every room, including the room I had opened at the end of the western hallway. We found no one. No clear signs of a break-in. No broken windows. Nothing. I spent the remainder of the weekend with family members present, and nothing similar happened again. Several months later, during a renovation, we discovered something that may explain part of the story. Behind an old cabinet was a small service passage connecting interior sections of the house that did not appear on the most recent floor plan. It wasn't exactly a secret tunnel, but it was a narrow space that allowed movement between certain walls and maintenance areas. We never managed to prove that anyone used that passage on the night I was alone there. We also never found concrete evidence that another person had been inside the house. Even so, I remained convinced that someone was there while I was upstairs. What makes me believe that isn't the noises coming from the locked room, nor is it the door I found in that hallway. It's remembering the feeling I had when I returned to the dining room and realized that simple objects had been moved only a few inches from where I left them. It didn't feel like vandalism. It didn't feel like theft. It felt like someone simply wanted me to know that I wasn't alone in that house. And that idea continues to bother me far more than any explanation we discovered afterward. Story 4. I was 41 years old when this happened. At the time, I worked as a real estate agent in Nashville, Tennessee. Part of my job involved visiting properties that were about to be listed for sale, taking photographs, conducting basic inspections, and preparing material for advertisements. Many times, I needed to visit vacant houses in rural areas without anyone accompanying me. Normally, this was never a problem. I was accustomed to spending hours alone in old houses, abandoned farms, and remote properties. In this particular case, I was sent to photograph a house located in the countryside, in a region surrounded by fields and small wooded areas. The property belonged to the heirs of a couple who had passed away several years earlier. The house was vacant and would be put on the market as soon as the photography survey was completed. I received the keys from the attorney handling the estate and arrived at the property shortly after noon. The place sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, with no visible neighbors nearby. It was exactly the kind of property I often encountered in that line of work. I spent the first hour photographing the exterior of the house and documenting portions of the land. The weather was pleasant and visibility was excellent. After that, I began photographing the interior rooms. As I usually do when working alone in vacant properties, I left the front door open to make it easier to move between the house and my vehicle. I would go inside, take some photos, step outside to retrieve equipment, and then return again. At one point, while walking behind the property searching for a good angle to photograph the land, I noticed something strange among a cluster of trees. There was a car parked partially hidden behind a row of cedar trees near the property line. From a distance, it looked abandoned. The paint was covered in dirt and part of the body was concealed by vegetation. It immediately caught my attention because there had been no mention of another vehicle on the property. In addition, I was certain the car could not be seen from the front of the house. It was a location someone would have had to deliberately choose in order to remain out of sight. At first, I assumed the car might belong to a neighbor or a worker who had used the area in the past. Even so, I decided to take a closer look. I walked across the property until I reached the line of trees. As I approached, I realized the vehicle appeared to have been there for some time. It was an older sedan covered with a thin layer of dust and dry leaves. None of the tires were flat, and there were no obvious signs of a collision or long-term abandonment. I looked through the windows, hoping to find a document or object that might help identify the owner. The interior was practically empty. There were no bags, clothing, or any visible personal belongings. I also saw no one nearby. The surrounding woods remained completely silent. After spending a few minutes examining the car, I concluded that it probably had nothing to do with the work I was doing. I took a few photos of the vehicle as a precaution and started walking back toward the house. That was when I noticed something that made me stop immediately. The front door was closed. It may sound insignificant, but I was absolutely certain that I had left it open. I had been going in and out of the house for more than an hour. In addition, the door was heavy and would remain open on its own when pushed fully open. I stood there for a few seconds trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe a draft had caused it to close. Maybe I had closed it myself without realizing it the last time I left, but neither explanation felt convincing. I continued toward the porch and studied the entrance. Everything appeared normal. There were no signs of forced entry or recent activity. Even so, I felt immediately uneasy. I opened the door and stepped back inside. The silence was total. Natural light streamed through the living room windows, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air. I called out loudly, asking whether anyone was there. I received no response. I stood still listening for several seconds. That was when I heard a sound coming from the upper floor. It sounded like footsteps slowly crossing one of the upstairs rooms. I froze immediately. The sound had been far too distinct to mistake for the ordinary creaks of an old house. It sounded like someone walking across wooden floorboards, one step then another, slow and spaced apart. I looked toward the staircase leading to the second floor and waited to hear something else. For several seconds, there was only silence. My first reaction was to rationalize it. Vacant houses make all kinds of strange noises, especially when temperatures change throughout the day. I had worked in enough old properties to know that. Even so, the sound seemed different. I took out my phone and walked to the base of the staircase. I called out again, asking whether anyone was inside the house. No response. Silence filled the building once more. I was almost convinced that I had exaggerated some ordinary noise when I heard another sound. This time, it seemed like something being lightly dragged across the floor upstairs. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. At that point, I began seriously considering the possibility that someone was inside the property. I climbed the stairs slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The second floor consisted of a central hallway and 3 empty bedrooms. The daylight coming through the windows made everything perfectly visible. As soon as I reached the top of the stairs, I looked toward each open doorway. No movement, no person. I walked down the hallway, checking the rooms one by one. The first bedroom was completely empty. The second contained only a few old pieces of furniture left behind by the previous owners. The third appeared vacant as well. I continued checking closets and small spaces where someone could be hiding. Nothing. After several minutes, I began feeling ridiculous for having gone upstairs so concerned. Maybe it really was just an old house making random noises. But as I was about to return to the staircase, I heard a creak from somewhere below me. Not from the second floor. From the first floor. It sounded like the front door being moved slowly. The moment I heard that sound, my stomach dropped. I was on the second floor, and the only staircase in the house was behind me in the hallway. I stood completely still, trying to listen more carefully. A few seconds later, I heard another noise from downstairs. It sounded like a footstep on the wooden floor of the main living room. The problem was simple. If someone really was inside the house, that person was now between me and the exit. I slowly walked to the top of the staircase and looked down. From there, I could see part of the living room and a section of the hallway leading to the front door. I saw no one. I also heard nothing else for several moments. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own blood pulsing in my ears. I took out my phone and started recording a video as a precaution. At that point, I was no longer concerned about photographing the property. I just wanted to leave as safely as possible. I continued watching the first floor for several seconds until a new sound caught my attention. It came from the kitchen, something like a chair being moved a few inches across the floor. That was enough for me to stop looking for explanations. I backed away a few steps down the second floor hallway and called the owner of the real estate company. I quickly explained what was happening and told him I believed someone was inside the house. While speaking on the phone, I heard another noise from downstairs, then another. They didn't sound like noises produced by an old structure. They sounded like movement, like someone slowly walking between the rooms. The owner told me to leave the house immediately and contact the local sheriff's office. That is exactly what I did. Keeping my phone in my hand, I ran down the stairs as quickly as possible and headed straight for the front door. The living room was empty. The kitchen was empty too. I saw no one during the entire trip to the exit. The moment I reached the porch, I went directly to my vehicle and locked the doors. From inside the car, I could see the entire front of the house. For several minutes, nothing happened. No one came outside. No window was opened. Nothing. Even so, I remained convinced that someone had been inside the house with me. The deputies arrived about 20 minutes later and conducted a complete search of the property. They found something interesting near the rear portion of the land. The car hidden among the trees was not abandoned as I had originally assumed. Although it was dirty on the outside, the interior contained recent water bottles, food wrappers, and several personal items. There were clear signs of recent use. The officers continued searching and eventually discovered a small improvised trail leading from the area where the vehicle was parked into the forest. However, no one was located that day. I never learned who owned the car or why it had been hidden behind the trees. It was also never proven that the same person entered the house while I was working. But to this day, I believe that is exactly what happened. The sequence of events seems far too simple to be a coincidence. First, I found a hidden car in an area where no one should have been. Then the front door was suddenly closed. Next, I heard footsteps upstairs and noises coming from downstairs while I was on the second floor. I have photographed hundreds of vacant properties throughout my career. That was the only time I ever felt as though I was sharing an apparently abandoned house with someone who did not want to be found. Story 5. I was 17 years old when this happened. At the time, I lived in a small town in Arkansas and spent many weekends at my aunt and uncle's property. They lived in a fairly isolated rural area surrounded by fields and a large stretch of forest behind the land. The house was far from the main road, and there were no visible neighbors from any of the windows. Even so, I enjoyed staying there because the place was peaceful and offered plenty of room for fishing, riding ATVs, and passing the time. One summer night, my aunt and uncle needed to attend an event in a nearby town and asked if I could stay at the house for a few hours to watch the dog. I had done it before and didn't see any problem with it. They left early in the evening and left me alone with the dog, a Labrador named Duke. I spent most of the night watching television and playing video games in the living room. Everything seemed completely normal. The house was quiet, and I had absolutely no reason to worry about anything. Shortly before going to bed, around 11:30 at night, I decided to take Duke outside one last time. My aunt and uncle usually kept him in a fenced area overnight to keep him from chasing animals. I grabbed his leash and went out through the back door. The night was warm but windless. The only lighting came from a bulb installed above the back door and another light near the garage. As I walked toward the enclosure, I noticed Duke was acting strangely. He normally ran around the yard full of energy, but that night he stood completely still, staring at the tree line behind the property. I assumed he had spotted a deer or a raccoon. Then I followed his gaze. That was when I saw someone standing among the trees. The figure was far away, maybe 40 or 50 yards from the house, but it was clearly a person. A man. He wasn't walking. He wasn't making any gestures. He simply stood motionless facing the property. For several seconds, I tried to understand what I was looking at. The longer I watched, the more obvious it became that the man was looking directly at the house. My first thought was that he might be a hunter or someone crossing a neighboring property, but the more I watched, the less sense that explanation made. It was almost midnight. Besides, there were no trails in that part of the forest. The man simply stood there. Duke kept staring in the same direction and began producing a low growl, unlike anything I had ever heard from him before. That was enough to eliminate any desire I had to remain outside. I secured the dog as quickly as possible and started walking back toward the house without taking my eyes off the figure. The man did not move an inch. When I reached the back door, I immediately went inside, locked it, and looked again through the kitchen window. He was still there, standing in exactly the same spot. I picked up my phone to send a message to my aunt and uncle explaining what was happening. As I typed, I continued watching the tree line. At some point, I looked away for only a few seconds. When I looked back, the man was gone. That made me far more nervous than when he had been visible. I ran to another window, trying to find him again. I scanned the entire edge of the forest. Nothing, the figure had simply disappeared. I kept watching for several minutes, expecting him to reappear somewhere on the property. No movement, no flashlight, no sounds from outside. I tried convincing myself that he had simply gone back into the woods. Even so, my sense of unease continued growing. That was when I heard a noise coming from inside the house. A short sound, but very clear. It sounded like a door being moved. I froze immediately. The noise had come from the direction of the laundry room, which was located down a separate hallway near the back of the house. For several seconds, I heard nothing else. Then came another sound. This time it resembled a footstep on the wooden floor in the hallway. My heart immediately started racing. My first thought was that I was hearing some part of the house settling, but that sound didn't resemble a creak. It sounded like someone walking. I stood in the kitchen trying to listen more carefully. Silence returned for a few seconds. Then I heard another footstep. Slow, heavy, coming directly from the direction of the laundry room. The hallway leading there was fairly narrow and out of my line of sight from the kitchen. I would have needed to cross part of the living room to see that area clearly. I remember my heart pounding so hard that it seemed impossible to hear anything else. I grabbed my phone and immediately called my uncle. While the phone rang, I kept watching the entrance to the hallway. When he answered, I quickly explained that I had seen someone outside and was now hearing noises inside the house. My uncle became serious immediately. He asked if all the doors were locked. I told him yes. He then instructed me to stay away from the windows and check for any signs of intrusion without getting too close to the hallway. That was exactly what I tried to do. I walked slowly into the living room and looked toward the laundry room. I didn't see anyone, but the hallway was dark and I couldn't completely see the area near the back door. As I watched, I heard another noise. This time it sounded like something lightly brushing against a wall or a piece of furniture. The sound came from the same direction. My uncle was still on the phone and told me to call the police immediately. As soon as we hung up, I did exactly that. I explained the situation to the dispatcher and informed them that I was alone on a rural property. Afterward, I locked myself inside the master bedroom, which had an interior lock. I continued hearing occasional sounds during the next several minutes. Some sounded like footsteps. Others were harder to identify. What frightened me most was that they never came fully closer. They seemed to remain in that section of the house, as if someone were slowly moving between the laundry room and the back hallway. At one point, I gathered the courage to look through the bedroom window toward the forest. The tree line was completely dark. There was no sign of the man I had seen earlier. That should have reassured me, but it had the opposite effect. I couldn't stop thinking that if he had truly left the woods, I had no idea where he had gone. The next few minutes felt like hours. I sat on the bedroom floor holding my phone and listening carefully for any sounds coming from the rest of the house. Sometimes everything would become completely silent. Then another noise would come from the direction of the laundry room. I tried to determine exactly what I was hearing, but it was impossible. Sometimes it sounded like a footstep. Other times it sounded like someone bumping into something. What made me even more nervous was how irregular the sounds were. They followed no clear pattern. They never occurred in a long enough sequence for me to determine whether someone was actually walking through the house. The police informed me over the phone that a patrol car was already on its way, but would take several minutes to arrive because of the distance between the property and the nearest town. I continued waiting. At one point, I heard a louder noise. It sounded like a door being shut somewhere in the rear section of the house. After that, everything became completely silent. No more sounds, no more footsteps, nothing. A short time later, I saw the headlights of a patrol vehicle coming up the property's access road. It was one of the greatest feelings of relief I have ever experienced. I remained in the bedroom until I heard the officers identifying themselves at the front door. When I finally came out, I explained everything that had happened and accompanied them as they searched the house. They checked every room, closet, and storage area. They found no one. However, during their inspection of the laundry room, one of the officers noticed something important. The back door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it earlier that night because I had used that exact entrance when I took Duke outside. In addition, there were fresh mud marks on the floor near the door. They weren't perfectly defined footprints, but they were enough to indicate that someone had passed through there not long before. The officers also searched the outside area with flashlights and found several impressions in the damp soil behind the house. The tracks led toward the forest. It wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it was enough to confirm that someone had probably been very close to the house that night. My aunt and uncle returned home shortly afterward, and the police remained on the property for a while before closing the incident. They never discovered who the man at the tree line was or what he wanted. They also never found a vehicle parked nearby or any other clue that might have helped identify him. For a long time, I tried convincing myself that the sounds inside the house could have had another explanation. Maybe the old structure produced strange noises. Maybe I was nervous after seeing someone in the woods. The problem was that the unlocked door and the mud marks were still there. To this day, whenever I talk with my aunt and uncle about that night, we all agree on one thing. The most frightening moment wasn't seeing the man watching the property. It was looking out the window a few minutes later and realizing he was no longer in the forest, because shortly afterward I began hearing footsteps coming from inside the house. Story 6. I was 31 years old when this happened. At the time, I worked as a nurse at a regional hospital in Wisconsin. It was a particularly difficult period for my family because my father was hospitalized after a complicated surgery. Since the hospital was relatively far from the city where I lived, I decided to spend a few nights at the old family house to avoid making long trips between work shifts and hospital visits. The house was located in a rural area surrounded by fields and small patches of forest. My parents had lived there for decades before moving to a smaller place several years earlier. Although the property remained vacant most of the time, it was still occasionally used by family members. I had known the place since childhood and had never been afraid to stay there alone. On the night in question, I returned from visiting my father at the hospital already exhausted. I spent a few hours organizing some things around the house, took a shower, and went to bed shortly before midnight. The weather was cold, and a light drizzle had been falling since the beginning of the evening. I have no idea how long I had been asleep before I woke up. The first thing I noticed was a sound coming from the kitchen. At first I thought I was dreaming. I remained lying in bed for a few seconds trying to understand what I was hearing. Then I recognized the noise. It was radio static, that constant irregular hiss that occurs when a radio cannot pick up a station. I grabbed my phone and saw that it was a little after 2 in the morning. I got up and walked to the kitchen. The sound was coming from an old portable radio that was usually stored on a shelf. It was an old device my father used years earlier to listen to the news while working in the yard. I didn't even know if it still worked. When I approached it, I realized it was indeed turned on. It was transmitting nothing but static. No voices, no music, just the hiss filling the silence of the house. I turned the radio off, shook my head at how strange it was, and returned to the bedroom. At that moment, my explanation was simple. probably some electrical issue or a button I had accidentally pressed during the day without noticing. I never managed to fall asleep again. Maybe 5 or 10 minutes after returning to bed, I heard the same sound once more. The static was echoing through the hallway. I lay still for a few seconds, trying to convince myself that it was impossible. I had personally turned the radio off, and yet the sound was there. I got out of bed and walked back to the kitchen. The radio was on again exactly as before. No station, just static. This time I examined the device more carefully. It was an old battery-powered model. I checked the buttons, turned it off, and even removed one of the batteries to make sure it would not turn itself on again. Then I placed it inside a kitchen cabinet. I closed the cabinet door and stood there for a few seconds watching. Everything remained silent. Satisfied, I headed back toward the hallway. That was when I noticed something different about the atmosphere. The kitchen felt colder than before. At first, I assumed it was simply because I had just gotten out of bed. But when I moved toward the back section of the house, I could clearly feel a draft of cold air entering. I followed the draft to the back door. As soon as I got close, I immediately saw the problem. The door was not completely closed. There was a small gap, perhaps 1 or 2 inches, enough to let the cold air inside. My first thought was that I might have forgotten to lock it before going to bed. But that made no sense. I was certain I had checked every door before going to sleep. Even so, I tried not to jump to conclusions. I grabbed the handle and slowly pushed the door. Before closing it completely, I instinctively looked outside. The back porch was illuminated by an automatic light installed above the entrance. That was when I saw the footprints. There were fresh boot prints scattered across the damp wooden porch. Some were only partially visible because of the continuing drizzle. Others were more clearly defined. I stared at them for several seconds, unable to process what I was seeing. The tracks did not move in just one direction. Some passed near the kitchen window. Others followed along the wall of the house. They seemed to indicate that someone had been walking around the residence for quite some time. At that moment, I felt a completely different kind of fear from the shock caused by the radio. The radio could have an electrical explanation. The footprints could not. I stood at the doorway watching the porch for several seconds. The drizzle continued to fall and the cold air drifted through the opening. The tracks were fresh enough that some still had sharply defined edges. I immediately shut the door, locked it, and began checking every other entrance to the house. As I moved through the rooms, I noticed that I was paying attention to every sound. The creaking floorboards, the rain tapping against the windows, the refrigerator motor turning on. Everything seemed threatening after discovering the footprints. When I finished checking the doors, I picked up my phone and began looking through the living room window toward the back porch. From there, I could see only part of the outside area. I saw no one. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been very close to the house not long before. Then something caught my attention. There were more visible footprints beneath one of the kitchen windows, directly below the same window where the old radio used to sit when my father still lived there. That made me uneasy. I grabbed a flashlight and, without leaving the house, began illuminating the outside areas through the windows. As I looked more carefully, I realized the footprints appeared at several points around the residence. Some crossed the back porch. Others followed along the side walls of the house. They did not look like the tracks of someone who had simply passed through the property. They looked like the tracks of someone observing it. At one point, I found a series of prints that passed directly beneath 3 different windows, before disappearing into the darkness behind the garage. That was when I began realizing something even worse. The person had probably not just arrived. Based on the different tracks scattered around the house, it seemed that whoever it was had spent quite a long time walking around the property. Maybe while I was asleep, maybe while I had been at the hospital hours earlier. There was no way to know. The only thing I was certain of was that someone had been very close to the house during the night. And for some reason, the back door had been found partially open. After that, I did not even try to go back to sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand and kept watching the windows. I called my brother, who lived about 20 minutes away, and quickly explained what was happening. As we talked, I continued looking toward the back porch through the glass door. The radio remained inside the cabinet without its batteries, but I was no longer thinking about it. My attention was completely focused on the outside of the house. At one point, my brother suggested that I check the security cameras. The property did not have a sophisticated system, but there was a simple camera mounted above the garage. The footage could be accessed through an old app on my phone. It took several minutes for me to connect. When I finally opened the recordings from that night, I found exactly what I feared. The camera showed a person slowly walking around the house. The image quality was poor because of the rain, but it was possible to distinguish someone wearing a dark jacket and boots. Several times the person stopped near the windows before continuing. I kept advancing through the recordings and found footage covering nearly an hour. The individual appeared at different points around the property, sometimes near the back porch, other times near the garage. At one point, the person stood still for several minutes looking toward one side of the house. The detail that disturbed me most was realizing that all of this had happened while I was asleep. While I was in my bedroom, that person had been outside walking around and watching the house. I also found the moment when the back door was moved. The camera did not show the exact angle of the entrance, but it showed the person disappearing from view in that direction and reappearing shortly afterward. I was never able to determine whether the person actually opened the door or merely checked to see if it was unlocked. A short time later, my brother arrived at the property. The two of us watched the footage again and then contacted the local sheriff's office. The deputies reviewed the videos and searched the area, but they found no one. The rain had erased most of the tracks before dawn. I spent the rest of that morning at the hospital with my father without telling him what had happened because I didn't want to worry him. For a while, I tried to find a simple explanation for everything. Maybe someone had been looking for shelter. Maybe it was a lost person. Maybe someone had mistaken the property for another house. The problem was that none of those explanations accounted for why the individual spent so much time circling the residence and looking through the windows. They also did not explain why the back door was found open shortly before I noticed the footprints. To this day, I do not know whether the radio had anything to do with what happened. It is possible that it was merely a coincidence caused by faulty wiring inside the device. But what I have never been able to forget is the sequence of events. First, the radio began broadcasting static in the middle of the night. Then I found the back door partially open. And then, through the footprints in the recordings, I discovered that someone had spent a large part of the night silently walking around the house while I slept alone inside. That is the part that still gives me chills whenever I remember that night.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.